Hello, and welcome to all my fellow explorers. It's lovely to have you back again, and for me to be back again because it's quite a few weeks now since I've been with you. Well, today we're going to be talking an exploration about the Bayeux Tapestry. This wonderful tapestry, which is in Bayeux, in Normandy, northern France. I'll be talking about Normandy as well, but before I start, I would just like to remind you that you are able to to text in questions, email in questions, I think. Is that right? Yes. And I've already had quite a few, so I hope that some of the questions I've already had will be answered during the lecture. So let's get cracking, please. Here we are, very familiar image from the Bayeux Tapestry. I don't know how many of you will have seen it, but it is a remarkable piece of work. Do you know, it's 230 feet long, roughly, about 15 inches high, and is 950 years old. It's quite extraordinary. But what it's about is a bit like a storyboard for a Hollywood epic, because it tells the story not just of the Battle of Hastings, which of course was in 1066, the date that most people, if there's one date they're going to remember, it's 1066. But it covers a period of a few years before, why the Battle of Hastings took place and why it's important. And of course, like a Hollywood epic, it contains so much of, it's a power struggle. It's jealousy, betrayal, broken promises, all sorts of things. So we'll be talking about that as we go along. It's a great story. So let's start. On to the next slide, please. I'm going to be looking at 4 sections. Why is the tapestry important? And then about halfway through or thereabouts, I'll be looking at Europe before 1066. And then, very importantly, what happened after 1066? It changed the history, not just of England, but certainly the history of a lot of countries that were associated with England. And I say England because at this point in 1066, England was a nation. Scotland was ruled by a king, Malcolm. Wales was a series of principalities. And in Ireland, the whole series of petty kings. So we're looking now at the history of England at this point, though Scotland will come into it a little bit later. And I'll be looking at Europe before 1066, and then a quick look at the Viking enrichment programme. So let's get cracking on the story. Now, what is the Bayeux Tapestry? Well, it's not actually a tapestry. Someone's already emailed in a question. I think it's Phil from Vancouver, from United States, Vancouver, saying that it is an embroidery, which of course it is. A tapestry is something very different, where the pictures are woven into the fabric. But this piece of work from Bayeux is based on great stretches of linen, very carefully joined together. In fact, it's only one join that you can really see. And then the pictures are layered onto it using needles and thread. It's a historical chronicle, certainly, and I'll be talking about that. It's an artistic masterpiece. Wow, yes. And one of the slides towards the end will show you just how well it was planned. And it's also a story of 11th century life. What life was like in the 11th century, in the 1000s. Very often we only hear about the people who are the aristocracy, the rulers. But in this case, there are the peasants who are fighting with Harold, and less so with William, because William's forces were much more professional. But it's also got civilians too, because there is a very, very poignant picture of a woman with her child fleeing from a house that had been fired by some of William's troops when they'd landed in the south of England. Let's then look and see what the story's all about. It's a story, first of all, of kings. And we've got here 3 kings, all of whom reigned England in the year 1066. As I said, it's a power struggle, and the two figures on the right were really vying for the throne of England. The figure on the left is King Edward the Confessor. He was childless, which is a problem in the medieval world because you needed a successor. But he had promised the throne to three different people. William in the centre, William on the left, on the right, Harold in the centre, and a Norwegian king as well, who thought he was the person who'd been chosen. Well, as you can see, Edward on the left is fairly elderly. By the time of the start of this, he's very frail. He's not really had much to do with the governing of the country. The person who has been governing in his place is the man in the middle, his brother-in-law, King Harold. Well, at that point, he was Harold Godwinson, an earl who had estates all over England. He was an Anglo-Saxon earl, just as Edward was. But Harold Godwinson's mother was a Danish noblewoman, so he was half Viking, half Anglo-Saxon. Now, Edward was dying. He was very frail. He was dying. And I should be talking more about what happened on his death, which happened on the 5th of January, 1066. He was buried the following day, the 6th, which is 12th night, very important date in the Christian calendar. And all the aristocracy, all the Anglo-Saxon noblemen would have been gathered at Westminster for the celebration. Now, usually the coronation comes some time after the death of the monarch. But in this case, Harold, who had actually, and you must remember this because it's an important point, he had actually been elected by the King's Council to be their next king. William tends to overlook this. William the Conqueror overlooks that fact. But Harold has himself crowned on the same day that Edward is buried. Now, this can be interpreted in two ways. Either that he was very anxious to get the throne, to be able to have the crown on his head, or a more practical solution to it possibly is that all these Anglo-Saxon noblemen had long journeys, some of them several hundred miles, and rather than disperse and then come back together again, perhaps 2 or 3 months later for the coronation, it was decided to have the coronation then. So take your pick. It could be either of those two stories. On the right-hand side is William, Duke of Normandy. And he had believed that he was one of the men who had been promised the throne. He thought he was also not terribly closely related, but he was first cousin once removed of King Edward. Now, you can imagine that when he heard that Harold Godwinson had been crowned King Harold II of England, he was absolutely furious. And straight away he began plotting and planning his invasion of England to take over the throne by force. Now, this is what the story is all about. But it doesn't stop there, because there were 3 other people who thought they had a claim to the throne. Now, the first of these was a young man. He was in his mid-teens, probably. His name was Edgar the Etheling. He was the closest blood relation of Edward, and perhaps an obvious choice these days. But then, in the medieval times, the king had to be able to lead his troops into battle. Edgar, at this point, had no experience. He wasn't battle-hardened. And so we can discard him, but he does appear later in the story. Then there was King Canute of Denmark. He sort of thought he had a claim to it and made occasional little forays, sending his brothers actually into England to try and negotiate it. But the third one is the one that we really need to have in our minds. He is King Harald Hardrada of Norway. Battle-hardened, 51-year-old, he had had plenty of experience of fighting and thought, although he had no connection with Edward at all, he thought that he would like to have England as part of his kingdom. So there we have 3 people, the Edward who has died, and there are now 5 people who possibly might be king. So let's go on to the next story, the next part of the story. And we have to go back some years. This didn't all happen, as I said, in 1066. It's the chronicle of the years running up to the end of the Battle of Hastings. But at one point, Harold Godwinson, was sent by Edward to see William of Duke of Normandy. And somehow he got blown off course. He got mixed up with a battle that was going on with the Duke of Brittany. In fact, he probably landed somewhere around the D-Day landing beaches on the way to Brittany. He was taken captive, and when William heard of this, he arranged to ransom Harold and free him. Here we see an image of William on the left. Oh, by the way, we call him William, but probably at the time he would have been known as Guillaume, which is the French version of William. That's one of the questions I had earlier in the day. And here is Harold with his hands on holy relics, swearing a sacred oath. What that oath was, again, there are two ways of looking at this. William was convinced that Harold was saying to him, look, I shall be loyal to you when you are King of England. Harold said he was simply saying, thank you for ransoming me. So again, take your pick. The story is full of misunderstandings. It's a great yarn. Let's go on to the next picture and see what that is. Well, it's a battle chronicle, certainly. Not just one battle, though. In fact, if you look at it very carefully, there are 4 battles that take place in this across the whole of this tapestry. I'll continue to call it a tapestry, although it's an embroidery. And here we have got the French cavalry. This is the Battle of Hastings, the big one at the end of the story, the important one. Well, the other ones were quite important too. We've already encountered one battle, and that was the one that Harold got taken captive, and that was at Mont Saint-Michel. Some of you may have visited there, that wonderful site on the Breton coast. Then there was another battle which comes later, which I'll talk about when we get there, and another battle after that as well, before Hastings. Now, these are the French cavalry. The English did not have cavalrymen. We can tell they are Norman French because they don't wear facial hair of any sort. The English, the Anglo-Saxons, wore moustaches, and you'll see that whenever you see Harold, you'll see he has a moustache, but William doesn't. Now, I like to think of this panel being embroidered by the nuns. The nuns at Canterbury in Kent are believed to have produced this wonderful piece of artwork. But I do wonder what that nun who had to embroider those 2 figures on the top right thought about what she was doing. Perhaps things were a little bit more open in those days, but certainly here are 2 men training for battle. So let's go on and see what happens next. It's obviously a tale of victor and vanquished, but there's more than one victor and there's more than one vanquished. The figure on the left on horseback is William of Normandy's half-brother. He was the Bishop of Bayeux. His name is Odo. Now, in those days, it was not uncommon for bishops to go to war and to fight on the battlefield. And here we've got a very good example of it happening. The only thing that they had to be careful of is that they were not allowed to carry a sword or an axe. So we can see he's got a long club there with which he can batter people on the head or thump around. It's a strange thing to us these days, but this is what was allowed. And it was probably Bishop Odo himself who commissioned this tapestry, which ended up, of course, in Bayeux Cathedral. More of that later. On the right-hand side is yet another, not a misunderstanding, but perhaps a misinterpretation. If you, like me, were brought up to believe that Harold had been killed by an arrow in his eye, I have to delude you, I'm afraid, because chemical analysis showed that that arrow, which is in the hand of the person on the left of that image, is much later than the original tapestry. What is more likely is that the figure on the right, on the ground, who's just been cut down, that's probably Harold himself, because contemporary reports say that he was chopped to pieces. It was brutal, this warfare. And so much so that William wouldn't release his body for burial. So no one actually knows for certain where Harold was buried. The other thing about the arrow in the eye might have been some sort of story that was added later, because the medieval iconography says that if you died from an arrow or from any sort of eye injury, it meant you were a perjurer, someone who couldn't tell the truth. And of course, this is the message that William is trying to get over. Let's move on now. This tapestry is also a demonstration of logistics. This is the story of William preparing for his troops and his navy, because he had to have ships to take him across the channel. And this wonderful series of images, series of scenes, which show how they built the ships. And that in itself, you can see all the different sorts of tools. You could see the master shipbuilder at work. And then all the preparations, the cutting down of the timber, the making it into planks, all the technology is there. And it's very similar to the technology of their ancestors, the Vikings, because the Normans were something like, by this time, 5th or 6th generation Vikings. They were descended from Rollo, who had been invited by the French king to take over some land in northern France. And the reason for this was that the Vikings were forever pillaging along that coast. They were sailing up the Seine, the River Seine, to Paris. They laid siege to Paris. And the king was getting a little bit fed up with this. His name, incidentally, is always referred to as Charles the Simple. But it's not really an accurate translation. It should really be Charles the Straightforward. So he gave Rollo land, and the deal was that Rollo would take over this land. He would defend France from invasion. He would have to convert to Christianity, and he also was given the hand of the king's daughter to seal the deal, so to speak. So this is why we refer to that part of France as Normandy now, because originally the name was Normannia, which meant the men from the north. So hence Normandy. So this wonderful demonstration of logistics, this scene shows us the boats being unloaded, the cavalrymen galloping off to find food and shelter and such like, and burn down a few houses. And what's interesting is that this invasion didn't take place until very late in the summer. Normally, the battle season was in high summer, when the days were long and the weather was fine. But it had been a dreadful summer, a bit like the summer of 1944, in fact, where there was constant wind, rain, there were northerly winds, which of course they couldn't sail against, not as a fleet. A single or 2 or 3 boats could sail against the wind, but it was too dangerous to launch his whole fleet. So William must have paced up and down those beaches, getting more and more frustrated, and eventually the wind changed. And this was September by now, very late in the battle season, but he was able to take his troops and the boats across to England. They landed at a place called Pevensey, and the first thing that happened was, as William stepped out of his boat, he tripped and fell. And his men thought, this is terrible, this is a really bad omen. But William, being a quick thinker, scooped up a hand of sand and stones, raised it in the air and said to his men, "Look, I hold England in my hands already." So he was a good PR man as well. You'll notice too that the vessels are coloured very much as the Viking ships are as well. You can see that they're made in the same sort of way, but they don't have the dragons on the head in this on the bow rather, in this particular case. William also had to be careful about crossing in bad weather, because ships were very vulnerable to weather, but also carrying horses. Horses do not like to be at sea. It's not possible for them, so they had to wait for that as well. Let's go on and see what else we can talk about now about the tapestry. It is a portrait of 11th century life. And here we've got a particularly nice instance. But I'm going to talk about the little inset picture first. The fox, the crow, and the cheese. One of Aesop's fables. There are something like 4 fables scattered throughout the tapestry. Why are they there and what's it all about? Well, those of you who are familiar with the fables will know that the fox saw the crow, which had cheese in its beak. And foxes apparently like cheese. I didn't know this, but anyway, they like cheese. And he really wanted this cheese, and he knew he couldn't possibly catch the crow. So he started flattering the crow. "Oh, you're such a beautiful bird. Can you sing as beautifully as you look?" And of course, as the crow opened his beak, the cheese dropped out, and the fox got the cheese. Why is it there? It's a warning against flattery. But who is it a warning for? Because Harold by this time has died. He's been killed. But is it a sort of veiled thing for William? Is that something that Odo put in, or whoever did the design? Possibly Odo. I suspect that Odo was involved in the design of it, though there was actually someone who designed it. We don't know who. This is the sad thing. We know that the people who made it were nuns from the religious house in Canterbury in the southeast of England, in Kent, not far from Dover. But here, the main picture shows the scene after William and his men have landed in England. He orders a banquet. And on the left, we see the preparation of it. The cooks, the chefs, they're busy. They've got their table there. They're chopping up food. They're preparing it. Something that looks a bit like kebabs, presumably roasting meat on a fire, over a fire. The food is ready. And you can see one of the figures at the table has got a horn. Not a drinking horn this time, but a horn to summon the men to their dinner. And you can just see the highest of the figures at the table is Bishop Odo himself, blessing the food before they eat. So this is a portrait of an aspect of 11th century life. Okay, we're looking at the nobility, we're looking at the aristocracy. It's not the sort of thing that most people would have sat down to. But notice too that on the table there are shields. Not the round shields that we know from Roman times, but by this time the Normans are using lozenge-shaped shields. Quite useful, good paddleboard on them, I suppose, if you wanted to. But anyway, these were the shields that they used. Let's go on. Now then, what is interesting is someone asked me the question, which I reply to later on, but how did they know what it looked like? There were nuns. The people who embroidered presumably weren't at the Battle of Hastings. No, they weren't. But whoever was designing this must have been, or certainly knew, had very good descriptions. The image on the left depicts the church in Bosham, which was the estate that Harold Godwinson had in the south of England, not far from Chichester, not far from Southampton. And you can see there that he's going into the church to pray, and in the church there is an arch. The image on the right is a photograph of the church as it is now, and you can see that very same arch with those 2 little points that jut out at the foot of the arch before the columns themselves, the top of the columns. So we know that whoever was designing this knew what he was doing, or she. Some people think it might have been King Edward the Confessor's widow. That's one of the theories. All along the borders, and you've seen already that there are borders at the top and the bottom, are all sorts of things going on. Sometimes it's activities, sometimes it's people doing things, sometimes it's very strange mythological beasts, which could well have been the coat of arms of the people who took part in the battle. So let's see what happens next. Why has Harold gone into the church to pray particularly? Well, here we are. He's setting off on his journey to France, the one I mentioned earlier on, where he met with captivity, got involved in that battle at Mont Saint-Michel, and was ransomed by William. So we can see whenever Harold appears at this point, he's carrying a falcon. The image on the right is embarking the boats to sail to France. Harold, curiously, is taking his falcon with him, as well as the hounds which are being carried on board by some of his men. And you can see they're wading through the waves, about to board the boat. Let's look at the next slide. It's a historical record. And famously, it depicts Halley's Comet. Can you see that? It's highlighted. It's enlarged, and then there's an arrow pointing to it. The men on the left are pointing to it in great wonder. What is this? Is it an omen? What does it mean? Omens, as you've probably gathered, meant a great deal to people in the past, as they do, I suppose, to a lot of people now. What does it mean for us? Does it mean we're going to meet with bad luck? Or is it going to be a catastrophe? Or does it just mean great change, that we're going to defeat the English, and the English will now become under our rule? So there'd be a lot of speculation as to this great star that appeared in the sky. And if you remember when Halley's Comet appeared a few years ago, there was a lot of speculation then. Omens were very important. In some of the sagas, for instance, the Viking sagas, if there were particularly dramatic displays of the aurora borealis, the northern lights, especially if the great patches of red, which occasionally you get to see. I've only seen them twice, but they were amazing when you get to see them. And they meant there was going to be a battle and a lot of bloodshed. So all sorts of stories. On we go. It is, of course, an exquisite work of art, an astonishing feat. 230 feet of it, in fact. And when you think about it, what are the resources to produce this? You need to have the linen. Now, linen can't be woven in one great length as it could be now. It had to be woven to the size of the looms that they had at the time. And those looms only produced a certain size, which meant that they had to join together a lot of these to make that great length. Just preparing the linen for that is quite a major undertaking in itself, a very expensive undertaking for whoever paid for it. And then the embroidery was done by the nuns using coloured wools. So the sheep had to be sheared, they had to card the wool, clean it, card it, spin it, and then dye it. So you've got these remarkable colours. And for those of you who are good at colours and good at spotting things, you'll notice that a lot of the colours on the Viking, our beautiful, beautiful Viking ships, are based on the tapestry. And of course, the tapestry itself, extracts from it, decorate the ship's stairwells. More of that later. This is Harold again. You can tell he's got a moustache, he's got a falcon, so he's instantly recognisable. But look at all the space that's around him. This is at the point where he's been captured. But you see how the work is done. There's stem stitch with black, very fine black wool, which outlines the figures themselves. And then they're filled in with these beautiful colours. Principally 2 embroidery steps, but those of you who are embroiderers, I know will take me up on that, because there are more stitches than that, but it's not the time to go into it. Look at the image on the right too. We've got a shield there, we've got all sorts of things. The horses are always very well done. Oh, and yes, incidentally, I think it's possible that only one nun actually embroidered the hands, because the hands always look the same. Keep an eye open for those. And another thing to look at about hands is if a hand is pointing, that means that person is talking. If the hand is clenched, they're being silent. They're not making conversation. Let's go on. So that is partly a little bit about why the tapestry is important. It is an important narrative. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and certainly it applies to this tapestry. It tells us more. We can look at it. Why was it made? That's the big question. Well, probably, as I say, commissioned by Bishop Odo, but it was made to be put on display just one day of the year, St. John's Day, which is the old Midsummer Day, before the calendars changed. And it would be stored on a huge wooden reel, which would then be rolled out, and the tapestry would be installed in Bayeux Cathedral for people to come and look at it. Let's now look at Europe before 1066, see what the political situation was like. Lovely, all the questions are coming in very quickly. It's great, thank you. Now, this is a map of Europe before 1066. What is interesting is that Southern Europe, which had been so important during the Roman age and had conquered, of course, so many of the lands that we see here, not Scandinavia, but much of Germany, Spain, France, Portugal, and Britain almost up to Aberdeen in Scotland, but they retreated from that quite quickly. The Swedes, the Swedish Vikings, had gone east across the Baltic, up this sea which takes you to the modern St. Petersburg, and then sailing down the great rivers of Russia. And incidentally, they gave the name Rus to the people who lived there, hence the name Russia. They set up the great ports of Novgorod and Kiev. They got to the Caspian, they got to the Black Sea, and many of them became the guards for the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, now Istanbul, of course. It's interesting that when the Roman Empire declined, it was the Western Empire that declined, not the Eastern. The Eastern one still went on for several centuries. The Norwegian Vikings, of course, are famous for their sea journeys across open ocean. And if any of you have sailed across the North Atlantic in a storm, as my husband and I had the experience of on the first transatlantic voyage on Viking Star, the sea can be very unkind. But the Norwegians knew about the water, knew about the sea, they knew about navigation. If you sail due west from Bergen, you get to Shetland. And then, of course, there's Orkney, all down through the Hebrides into the Irish Sea and round onto the west coast of Ireland. Of course, they went further than that. They went to the Faroes. They went to Iceland. They went to Greenland. And eventually they ended up at Lasso Meadows in Newfoundland. And again, one of the places that we visited on Viking while I was lecturing. But the Danes were very different. They travelled west because if they do that, they hit the coast of England and southern Scotland. And you can see there with the rather deep golden colour that that's exactly what they did. They also sailed down through the English Channel, and you can see there that when they got to Brittany, that was the problem. They were invading into Paris. They sailed right out into the Atlantic, down past the Spanish coast, through the Straits of Gibraltar, and raided various places in France. So this is how the northern part of Europe was parcelled out. It's a big area because from the easternmost part of the Swedish Danes right over to Newfoundland is about a quarter of the Earth's area north of the Mediterranean. It's a big area. Their navigation was fascinating, but that's for another lecture. Let's go on now and see what happened after that. They'd raided the British Isles, and you can see here that the red areas are the areas that were raided and settled. It's a long story, but they only had part of the English coast and the Scottish area, the east parts, and down in the southwest was an area called Wessex. But eventually Alfred conquered that. He was king. He wasn't king, but one of his descendants was king of all England. And you can see that the Vikings had a great interest in England. They didn't conquer Scotland. They did settle in places like Shetland and Orkney and the Western Isles and the Irish Sea area, including the island that I sit on at the moment, which is the Isle of Man, and right along the Irish coast as well. So they had a huge area of influence. They did raid and they did trade as well. And there's more and more evidence that they were trading quite early on. So that's the chronology of the Viking excursions into the rest of the world. Their shipbuilding enabled them to. They had these wonderful new design of a ship that no one had had before. It rode the waves. It wasn't stiff. They called them sea horses sometimes. Sea stallion was a popular name for the vessels. Let's move on then and see what happens next. Well, we need to know about Normandy, which is where William the Conqueror, came from. By the time that we're talking about the middle of the 11th century, there was very little Viking influence left. They had made themselves French. But the founding of Normandy at the beginning of the 10th century was down to this man Rollo, and down to the Charles the Simple, Charles the Straightforward on the right-hand side, who did this deal with Rollo. Provided he was baptized a Christian, provided he was able to guarantee that he would guard this entrance to France, that's just so vulnerable, he would be given the land that's outlined there in yellow. And Bayeux is just on the left-hand side of that, but just to the right of that peninsula that's sticking out, the Cotentin Peninsula. It's very important strategically because not only did the Seine give access to Paris, but one of the tributaries gave access to Chartres, which was a very important site as well. So this is the story of Normandy. Now, William was illegitimate. His father was the previous ruler of Normandy. Excuse me. And he had inherited this. He had had a tough childhood. He was a tough man. He was certainly battle-hardened at a very early age. So this is where we are. You can see it faces right across to England. And those of you who are very familiar with the history of the Second World War will know these are exactly the beaches that were the D-Day landings on June 6th, 1944. So this is an area which was used to war, used to battles, used to armies moving across the area of Normandy. You can see that they didn't sail the shortest distance across to England. They took that distance, which is much longer, and got them to Hastings. The current came in and blew them slightly eastwards so that they landed further east on the coast of England. And of course, where the battle took was named Battle, in fact. So there is a town called Battle. Let's move on. At the same time, I mentioned King Canute earlier on. This is the empire as it was, Danish King Canute and his northern territories, his North Sea Empire. Again, it's strategic. He's not only controlling the English Channel, but the important one is he's controlling the entrance to the Baltic Sea. And from the Baltic Sea, anyone wanting to sail in or out would have to pay taxes. This is the Kattegat, the famous Kattegat and the Skagerrak. He also rules part of Norway and part of southern Sweden, which gives him that access. The whole of Denmark, of course, and that part of England right up to the Murray Firth and just a little bit past Edinburgh. And you'll see that the areas in white are not ruled by the Danes. The areas we've looked at earlier, the ones, the Hebrides, Orkney, Shetland, and the Irish Sea, were settled by the Norwegian Vikings. And here on the right, we see Canute saying he is king of all England, Denmark, and the Norwegians, and some of Sweden. So that's the situation, the political situation at the time of the battle. Let's move on. Actually, it's a bit before the battle, because by this time Canute had been overcome, and it was now Anglo-Saxon. England was now Anglo-Saxon. So we've looked at the tapestry, we've looked at what Europe was like before 1066, and we're now going to look at what happened after the battle. So let's go on to have a look at that. Now, this is the crux of the story. All that we had before, with Harold going to France and with all the preparations for the battle, now we get to 1066, the year that changed everything. And what a year. Now, the image on the top left, again, these are all images from the tapestry, shows Edward on his deathbed. And you'll see that there is a figure bending over him, and the king is whispering words into this man's ear. That man is Harold. And he said that Edward had told him that he was going to be the successor to Edward. He was nominating him as his successor. I've already talked about the fact that it was the Christmas period, that Edward died on the 5th of January, was buried on the 6th. These are important religious festivals. It's important to remember, a lot of the Viking sagas, the incidents happen on important Christian festivals. And then, of course, Harold was crowned king the same day that Edward was buried. But again, there's one of these misunderstandings here. And the whole story is full of them, but history is full of them too, I suppose. On the right-hand side of the top right image, you can see a hand. Now, that hand belongs to Archbishop Stigand, Archbishop of Canterbury, who has crowned Harold. The only snag is that Stigand has been excommunicated, so it's not a legal coronation. That's something that William was very keen, or Odo, if he commissioned it, very keen to stress. And of course, the 6th of January is important. It's Epiphany. It's a very important part in the Christian calendar. It was an invasion not just by William, but that other man I mentioned. Remember, the Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada. And his name gives away the fact that he was a tough man. He was in his early 50s. He had meanwhile heard that the that Edward had died, that Harold had taken the throne, but he wanted it for himself. He had no claim to it. He just thought it'd be a good thing. So he landed not far from York on the northeast coast of England in September. There was a little skirmish. This was a mini battle, but there was no outcome because it was local troops who were defending, and I think the Norwegians were just trying it on to see what the strength was like. But word was sent down to Harold, who was at Westminster in London, and he immediately mustered his troops. And this is the astonishing thing. He marched them 200 miles up the old Roman military road, now used to be the A1. And they surprised the Norwegians, and there was this great battle, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and Harold Hardrada was killed. Now, there's another curious thing here too, because you remember the arrow in the eye? Well, the story went that Hardrada was actually killed by an arrow in his neck. So it could be that that story about the arrow in the neck had got confused in the telling over many generations of oral history. And in fact, it was Hardrada who'd had the arrow and not Harold. That was done, and just as soon as the battle was over, Harold had news that William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey. Now, he had a decision to make, a very difficult decision. They were coming into winter, coming into October. If he stayed where he was, they could starve William out. In fact, that was what Harold's mother said and advised that Harold should do, but he didn't take any notice of his mother. So he gathered up his troops again, and this time marched 270 miles. So this army has marched 470 miles, had a tough battle as well, in just over 3 weeks. It's quite a remarkable achievement. Remember that the armour that the men were wearing, something which we call chainmail, which is not the correct term for it, I believe, that weighs a lot. It takes 2 men to carry one set of it. And they were marching. When only the noblemen would have had horses. The rest of the troops would have been on foot. So they arrive down in Sussex, near Hastings, and there is William waiting for them. He's landed in September, but by now it's the middle of October. The days are drawing in, and the weather is deteriorating, and the battle takes place. And extraordinarily, Harold again sort of surprises William, just as he did with Harold Hardrada, because he gains the high ground. Now, the battle tactics are very different between the two forces. I mentioned the French cavalry. That was the important bit for the French, the archers and the French cavalry. But for the English, it was the archers and the shield wall, something we're familiar with Roman history. The men locked their shields together in a great wall, and provided that wall held, all would be well. The cavalry couldn't do anything about it, because between the shields or under the shields, they would stick long spears. So any horse or any man trying to get to the shield wall would be impaled immediately. Let's see what happens next. On the next slide, you'll see that there are 2 battles, 2 dead kings, and the question is was Harold too tired to fight again? You know, he'd already had this immense journey, 200 miles north from London and then 270 miles south to Hastings, having fought this pretty heavy battle in the meantime. You can see there an image on the top right is of the Norwegian king being killed. And we've already seen this image of Harold on the lower right image. But he wasn't too tired to fight. The English were actually in control of the battle for much of the day. And then something quite extraordinary happened. Rumour started moving around amongst the French troops that William had been unhorsed. Now, in those days, if you were off your horse, you'd had it. If you found yourself on the ground, you couldn't move terribly quickly because of the mail that you were wearing, the heavy armour you were wearing. And rumour spread to the English troops, who cheered because they thought, this is it, we've won. They broke the shield wall and raced down the hill and were slaughtered, including Harold. So that is the very dramatic end to the Battle of Hastings. On we go. Next slide, please, James. England is now in the hands of William of Normandy. He gives himself the title King William of England. A lot of things happen at this point. It's a totally different culture. It's totally different from the Anglo-Saxons. He tells the Anglo-Saxon noblemen that they either have to bow their knee to him or they will be killed and their estates will be taken. Well, some withstood, but most of them didn't. And they were allowed to live, provided they handed over everything. So all the Norman barons came in and took over these great estates. They implemented all sorts of new laws, which completely took away the freedom of a lot of people that they'd had under the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons are rather like the Norwegians, or rather like the Vikings. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a bit of a cold this last week, and I shall be with you in a moment. Right. They built these great buildings, this great bastion, which is the Tower of London. Again, I'm sure many of you might have visited when you've been sailing in or out of Greenwich. And the White Tower, as it was known. And if you look at photographs of Windsor Castle, you'll see that the centre part of the castle there is a great round fortress on a mound. And that is also Norman in origin. on the right-hand side is Durham Cathedral, one of my favourite cathedrals in England. I've been fortunate enough to sing there quite often. It's a powerful cathedral. The columns are inscribed with zigzag lines. And the first time I went there, I was just overcome by the whole appearance of this. It did exactly to me what it was meant to do to the Anglo-Saxons of centuries ago. This was power. This was the powerhouse of the north. And this is really important because the north of England didn't knuckle under to William. They kept rebelling, they kept fighting, just as some of the people in Ely as well, in the East Anglia, the eastern part of England, guerrilla warfare going on. Eventually, William got fed up with these rebellions, and he sent his troops up there with the orders to a scorched earth policy, to kill every person they came across, to burn every house, to kill every animal, and to burn the crops. And it took generations before north of England recovered from that. And it never has quite recovered. There's a folk memory still. And there is still this sort of edginess between the north and the south of England. It's a cultural thing. And it's just extraordinary that it's lasted so many centuries, almost 1,000 years. No doubt will continue to last, unfortunately. But Durham was the centre of the power. William had appointed a Norman bishop, of course. All the clergy were now Norman. Certainly the influential clergy were Norman. And he gave him an extra title, not just the Bishop of Durham, but the Prince Bishop of Durham, and gave him the power to raise taxes, to raise an army, and to impose law. And this was to try and keep the north under control. So Durham, magnificent building, was also a symbol of Norman power and bullying, if you like. And then, of course, the Domesday Book at the bottom, this great source of information about what England was like in the 20 years after the invasion. In it are listed virtually every person, every animal, every piece of land, every owner. And ostensibly it is for raising taxes, but recent research has suggested that it's for more than taxes, because the estates, the areas, are not listed geographically as you'd expect, but they're listed as under the ownership of the baron, the Norman baron who owned those particular properties. And it was also William's way of keeping control of his barons. Now, this was important. It was going to be important 150 years later, because the king on the throne then, King John, was not a powerful king. He was the youngest son of quite a scutch of, I think, 4 or 5 boys in that family. He never expected to be king. And in fact, 30% of the monarchs of England and later the United Kingdom were not expecting to be monarch. They're not expecting to take over the throne, including the present Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, whose father was a second son, and she only became the heir to the throne because her uncle abdicated, of course. King John was a weak king, not popular with the barons at all, and they presented him with something called the Great Charter, the Magna Carta, which set out all sorts of ideas for how the country should be ruled. And that, of course, was not just important in terms of England and English history, but has a great influence with the Constitution of the US, with other things that came along afterwards as well. It helped to shape the United States. There were bad things as well because of the brutality of what was going on, but also the Anglo-Saxons, rather like the Vikings, had given their women much more freedom. But those women had the freedom taken away from them. They became the chattels of their husbands. And if you think about it, right until the early part of the 20th century, many women were not even able to own anything, not even the clothes they stood up in. So that was one of the bad things that happened after the Normans. Now, let's move on quickly because I realise time is moving quite quickly. The tapestry has been used in all sorts of ways. It was nearly destroyed at the beginning of the 19th century when French Napoleon's soldiers took it out of the cathedral in Bayeux and started cutting it up to cover the wagons. And they were only stopped because there was a French lawyer there who recognised the importance and gave them money to buy the tapestry. It came into prominence again in the 20th century after the successful invasion of France by the Germans. And Hitler, towards the end of the war, was getting ready to take it back to Berlin when the war came to an end. I love the image on the right-hand side, the New Yorker, 15th of July, 1944, right at the height of this long, long invasion of D-Day landings. You know, it was 85 days of fighting before they won through. And on the top left, we've got three figures, the king wearing his crown, behind him Roosevelt, and on the right-hand side of the image, unmistakably the figure of Churchill. On the next part of it, we have Montgomery, the British general, and Eisenhower. And then below that, we've got the landing craft going in the opposite direction this time. And instead of jumping out, the cavalry jumping out on the horses, we've got men with rifles landing on the beaches. And then we have them chasing the Germans, and there's a German with his hands surrendering. So this was still something that still resonates with us today for whatever reason, but a rather interesting cover there. Now, I want to move on to the next section. Oh yes, this is a really interesting thing. New research which came out last year. This is Bayeux Cathedral on the left. On the right-hand side is the ground plan. Now, you've got to imagine that it's been twisted around a bit on the slide, but at the bottom of the image is the west end of the cathedral with the steps. That's the entrance you go in. At the top of the picture is the east end with the high altar. Now, this is almost conclusive proof that the tapestry was designed specifically for Bayeux Cathedral. At the top left of that U-shaped red shape, linking some of the columns, which are shown as little circles, at the top left is the story begins of the tapestry. This is the story of Edward the Confessor. He's quite close to the altar. He is a true king, so he can be close to the altar. The whole of that red line on the left-hand side, going down to the steps, tells the story of Harold going to France, meeting William, or being ransomed by William after he was captured. And then the final point on the bottom left is the point where Harold is crowned. It takes all that time to tell that story. And then we go across the nave to the right-hand side, and this is the story of the gathering of the troops and the building of the boats and the journey itself. And if you can see that arrow, there's a box on the right which gives you information. If you can see that arrow, that's almost just a little bit higher than that, a little bit lower than that would be the point at which the Battle of Hastings comes in. The Battle of Hastings only takes up a seventh of the whole story, but it's the bit we all know and the bit we all remember. And it fits perfectly. So people coming in would be able to see this and see what the story was. So I think that's conclusive proof that it was designed for the cathedral by someone who knew what he or she was doing. Let's move on because time is running out. Let's look at something very close to my heart, the Viking enrichment programme. I've been a Viking resident historian right since the beginning of the programme, and I've had such joy and pleasure from being part of the project. So let's look at what happens. We've already talked about the fact that there are extracts, and here you've got the Pevensey landing. This slide shows us the landing of William's troops at Pevensey. But next time, and I hope it won't be too far off, next time you're on one of our beautiful Viking ships, take a little bit more notice perhaps than you have in the past. Get out your phone or your iPad and load the app and start at the forward end of the ship on deck 9, work your way down deck by deck to deck 1, and then maybe stopping at the bar for a coffee or a drink, then go to the aft stairwell and go up to deck 8 and work your way down, and you'll see as you get to deck 1, the story ends. And of course, the last bit of the tapestry is actually missing, because that was the bit that's cut off, and that would have been the bit that showed William being crowned. Now, sometimes you'll find that there is actually a conducted tour. It's quite a long one. It takes about an hour and a half, an hour and 3/4. But if you get a chance, do join in. And then, of course, we have on deck 2, on the next slide, we have the heritage, the gallery. It's just such a wonderful thing to have. It contains replicas of a lot of the very special Viking finds. For instance, on the bottom right of the left-hand picture, you can see 2 figures in walrus ivory from Greenland. These are part of the Lewis Chessman set. These are replicas, obviously, and there are bigger versions of them down on deck 1 as well. And these would have been made in Western Norway, probably Trondheim. And there are all sorts of other things as well. The thing that I always like to point out to people is a Thor's hammer in silver from Iceland. But it's just at the point where the Icelanders are moving from paganism to Christianity, where they're being converted because they had no choice really, or else Norway would cut them off. But in the centre of it is hollowed out a cross, so they're hedging their bets. And if you want to know whether you're a Viking or not, go to the far end where that stool is, where the chair is, and you'll be able to read that and see if you have got Viking genes. But of course, the best bit, well, not the best bit, but a really wonderful bit, which entrances people, is that television screen on the left, which shows the Battle of Hastings in an animated way. I told you it was a storyboard. This is a film in the making. And it's instead of having Latin titles, it has English titles. So next time you're on board, don't overlook it, because it's really special. Right, I think we're drawing to a close now. Let's see what we have on the next slide. Right, a summary of what we've been talking about. Well, we know it's a historical chronicle, a very, very vivid, very, well, picture's worth 1,000 words. We know exactly what the story was. There are headings which we can translate, but there are all sorts of questions there as well, which we can't be sure of. It's really good because we've got plenty to talk about. We saw them preparing food for the banquet. There's a record of medieval life. We see the soldiers. It's also, of course, an exquisite work of art worked by those nuns in Canterbury, whose work was famous across Europe. Why did they get Canterbury nuns, English nuns, to do this? It was because they were famous for their work. And they were the best that was in. So Odo, or whoever commissioned it, was going to get the best that there was. The Normans, of course, had Viking heritage, which they'd really long lost touch with. There were 4 kings in this. There were 2 battles. Well, actually, as I said, there were 3 major battles, but 1 skirmish. But the summary of it all is that it is a conquest that changed England forever. And in doing that, it changed quite a lot of the history of the Western world forever as well, certainly in the States, in Canada, and in the colonies as well. That, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me. I hope you've managed to survive till the end of this rather long lecture. But it is a fascinating story, and I've only just skimmed the surface of it. And I can see there are lots of questions coming in. So I will, if you now have other things to do, which I'm sure you have, I would like to say thank you again. And also thank you to James and Heather and Claire for all their support in setting it all up. It's a huge amount of work for them, and I know we all appreciate it enormously. So keep well, keep safe, and I hope to see you sometime on one of the lovely Viking ships. Thank you very much. I'll look at the questions now and see if I can answer them. So I'm just going to move that round so I can see it a little bit better. Oh, thank you, Christine from Dublin. That's really kind of you. She's a great presentation. She said, thank you. You can tell I love the subject. David from the United States, what happened to the missing piece of the tapestry? Well, no one knows. It possibly went off in one of the carts, but it's been lost. There have been all sorts of stories about it in the past, but no one knows for certain, which is really sad. I have to tell you that I pointed out those naked men in training for the army in Reading in England in the last century, but well, in the 19th century. Some of the Victorian ladies decided they were going to make a copy of the tapestry, which they did. But they were Victorian ladies, and naked men didn't come into it, so they gave them all trousers. That's quite nice, I think. Oh, that next question. Is it Jon from Cape Town in South Africa? Oh, we're traveling the world. This is great. Oh, and a difficult question. When did the Vikings adopt Christianity as their religion? Well, it depended where you were. Danes were the first to convert to Christianity. Harold Bluetooth, that should be a name that's familiar, Bluetooth. And the symbol that you see on modern technology was the symbol of his name. And he converted his country to Christianity because all the countries to the south on mainland Europe were Christian. So it took away one reason why they wouldn't attack Denmark. Norway followed a little bit later, and Sweden after that. If you want to know more about this, there's a very interesting book which is called an atlas, a historical atlas of the Vikings. And I've opened it at the page concerning the topic we've been talking about. And you can see that on one page there is a map, and on the opposing page is a short summary of what it's about. It's called the Penguin Historical Atlas of the Vikings. It's by a very fine scholar, a friend of mine, John Haywood. So that's worth getting. It's a very, very useful book, just as an introduction to the Vikings. He's very accurate, very, very good indeed. So thank you, Jon, for that. Now we've got Ron in Toronto. How is it in Canada at the moment? Have you got cold weather yet, or is it still not too bad? Right, how is the tapestry hidden and kept safe during World War II? Partly because the Germans got to France and overcame it, and Hitler, you probably know, was very keen on the Nordic mythology and the Nordic traditions, reckoning that the Germans were part of that. So I don't know whether it had been hidden before, whether it was perhaps hidden somewhere and they found it. But I have to look that. That's a question I can't answer, I'm afraid. So thank you for asking. I like questions I can't answer because it broadens my knowledge as well. The next question is from Heather in Minneapolis. Why was it created in the first place? Well, that's something I should have covered, and I'm afraid I didn't. Yes, it was a political move because it was just to emphasize the fact that this was the way that William had got the throne, that he was really the rightful heir. And it was just a way of emphasizing it. And of course, as I mentioned, it was brought out once a year on St. John's Day, and just really sort of emphasizing the fact that he was the true king. Anthony from the Villages, often interesting place to be. The United States. Do you recommend any books about the tapestry and historical events? Thank you for that question. Yes, I've already mentioned the John Haywood book, the Penguin Historical Atlas of the Vikings, but probably the best book about the tapestry is published first, I think, in 1995, and then reissued more recently than that. It's a standard book, beautiful. It's a coffee table book. It's quite big, but it's got every scene of the tapestry in full colour. And then in the second half of the book, every scene of the tapestry reduced in size in black and white, with the description underneath each scene as to what's going on. The author is David M. Wilson, David Mackenzie Wilson, who is one of the leading Viking scholars, and the textbook that he produced in 1980-something is still a standard textbook. He was the professor of archaeology at Cambridge, and then latterly he was the director of the British Museum, and that's what the book looks like. And if I open the page, just to give you an idea of how splendid it is, just a random page, there you are, it gives you an idea. It's a big book, it's heavy, but I've checked today and it's still available. So that is one that I have drawn on a lot for this lecture. So thank you for that question too. Now, this is something I think it's an interesting question. This is from Leticia from Falls Church in the United States. Did the author draw the subject outline before embroidering? Was it embroidered directly onto the fabric? You must be an embroiderer, I think, Laetitia, is that right? I think whoever designed it did it very carefully. We've seen that from the way it was set up in the cathedral. So there must have been a lot of drawings, and those drawings would have been transferred onto the linen very, very carefully. And the interesting thing is that some of the scenes actually go over the joins in the linen, so you don't see the linen. You don't see the join, rather. You see the linen, but not the join. So I'm sure that must have been the case. It couldn't have been done freehand, because there is one person who I think did all the drawings for this. That's just my theory. I don't know for certain. I hope that answers your question, Leticia. And where are we going? Which direction do we go in here now? Anthony, oh, that's the one I've just done. Scott, Grapevine in the US. Ah, what a good question. How did the tapestry get from Canterbury to Bayeux? Well, obviously it would have to be by sea, but can you imagine the responsibility of the captain of that boat? And these are open boats, don't forget, of transporting this. From Canterbury, he'd go from Canterbury down to Dover, probably, or I can't remember which river flows from Canterbury and where it comes out, but he would have possibly had it taken down by road, or may have been able to get up to Canterbury itself, and then sailed down through the English Channel, hoping and praying there would be no storm. And it got there safely. And then, of course, it was able to be offloaded and then taken up into Bayeux, into the cathedral. It's a good question. As I say, one I hadn't thought about before, but it's a good one. Anthony, again, another question. Right, oh, good. You've obviously been... I'm glad. I love this when there are lots of questions, because it means that I hope I've triggered ideas. I hope it doesn't mean that I haven't included the things I was supposed to talk about. But anyway, can you talk about a little about what was involved to create the tapestry, the thread, how long it took to create? I visited the tapestry. This is Heather now from Minneapolis. I've skipped one, and I'll go back to Anthony's in a moment. How long it took to create the tapestry? They think probably about a decade, which doesn't surprise me, because when you think of the amount of work, and nuns wouldn't just be working at it all the time. They were working by in daylight, but also during the winter there would be very restricted hours when they'd be able to work. So I wouldn't be surprised. I believe that 10 years or so. That's interesting that you bought yourself a kit and tried the stitches and was impressed with the techniques. That's terrific. So you had to go at you get a greater understanding when you try to do something like this, I think, too. So thank you for that, Heather. Anthony, back to you. How do we know so much about what each panel of the tapestry portrays? Did the creator, nuns or other contemporaries, write down descriptions, primary source of the panels? Or do historians rely on secondary sources? Well, in a way, there's two questions there, because the person who designed it must have known so much about the techniques of battle, about the armour. You see the difference between the types of armour that the English and the Normans wore. So this is someone who had an intimate knowledge of the events that were going on at the time. But of course, the historians have interpreted, David Wilson, for instance, as an archaeologist, and from the historians as well, who've studied the documents of the time. They bring all this information together and interpret. I'm sure most people who do it have got a different interpretation of some aspect of it. It's not a single interpretation. There's lots of questions. And that's what keeps historians happy. The more questions they have, the more they can have conferences and meet up and debate it. So let's now go to Phil in Vancouver. And I had to check this because it says United States, but I gather that there is a Vancouver in the United States. Yes, what do the various animals on top and bottom represent? Well, this is a big question. No one really knows, even the people who studied the tapestry. People have stabs at saying what it might be. And mostly, I think the consensus by a lot of people is that these are the coats of arms of the noblemen who are part of the two armies. I haven't gone into this in any detail, but that would seem to be the correct interpretation of them. It could be that they also had symbolic meaning at the time. But again, lots of questions. People have written books and books about this. So thank you for that question. The answer is we don't really know, but people have guesses. And there's been a huge amount of work gone into those borders as well. So they weren't taking them lightly. They weren't just there for decoration. Helen in St. Petersburg in the US again. Now my English history is not sufficient to answer this question with any degree of accuracy, but if you like, Heather, I'll look at Helen rather, I'll look it up. The question was the House of Plantagenet related to William? I'll have to look that one up. Sorry about that, but I'll try and get back to you on that. Tony from Springfield in the US. How many people would have worked on creating a tapestry? How long might it have taken to create it? Do we know for whom it was created? Well, as I said, during the lecture, I've tried to address some of these queries. We don't know how long, but the general feeling is that it took 10 years to complete. But I imagine it would have been worked on the whole of that time, because if it was Bishop Odo who commissioned it, he would have been saying, when's it ready? You know, when you've, like any person who's ordered something, when's my new car going to be ready or whatever? This is rather special because he was anxious that he and his brother, the new King of England, would get all the credit that they deserved. So thank you for that question. We know it was created to install in the abbey, in the cathedral rather, in Bayeux, and Odo, who probably commissioned it, was the bishop there. So that's as far as I can go on that one, really, I'm afraid. Right. Cinder, United States. Is it true the tapestry will be on display out of France in 2021? Well, I don't know how far the negotiations or the arrangements have gone, but it was supposed to be coming to England. And it'll be very exciting to see if it does. There'll be huge queues, and you have to book way in advance to get tickets to go in. So we shall wait to see. Of course, all this business over the COVID-19 virus at the moment has put so many things to one side, or delayed them anyway. So we shall have to wait and see. Virgil J from Denver in the US. I hope I've answered your question. Could I describe the different characters depicted in it? I hope I've gone some distance to answering that. And I also mentioned right at the beginning that the Norman French name for William is Guillaume, which is the question. The question was where? Yes, where is Guillaume? I think the answer, another question, really, that the question should be phrased, who is Guillaume? And Guillaume, of course, is William, Duke of Normandy. It's like the modern French Guillaume, which is the French for William as well. Laura in Palm Coast, that sounds lovely. It's beautiful weather with you, I hope. We had planned a holiday last April, which included a visit to admire this masterpiece. Are waiting to reschedule our visit to France when COVID-19 is no longer a threat. Very wise of you to postpone. But yes, you can visit the tapestry if you do the journey, the cruise from Bergen to Barcelona, or Barcelona to Bergen, because you stop very close to the Normandy beaches, and you can either choose to go to the Normandy beaches to see the remnants of the Second World War, or to Bayeux. Those are two of the excursions from there. And whale racing, I haven't yet seen the real thing, I have to admit at this point. I was on Viking, and I had the chance of going there, but I had to leave the ship at that point because I was giving a lecture in England and had to leave to cross over to Portsmouth or Southampton. And the tour was due back about a quarter of an hour after I had to leave, so I couldn't risk that. And I'm very sorry about it. One day I shall get there. And yes, so there we are. Are there any more questions that have come in, do you think, James, or is that it? I think that's it. Right. Oh, there's some more there, are there? Right. Oh, yes. Right. Richard in Auburn in the United States. Oh, what a question, Rick. What's the assessed monetary value of the tapestry? It's priceless. You couldn't put a price on it, though I'm sure the insurers have named a figure, but it's a one-off. You know, it could never be replaced if anything happened to it. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question. I wouldn't even begin to try to answer that. Phil from Vancouver. Oh, thank you, Phil. That's a nice compliment. For my information, oh good, Vancouver, Washington, USA was founded as a Hudson Bay trading outpost. Oh, how interesting. Many decades before Vancouver, BC. Oh, that's nice. You admit that Vancouver, BC is much more beautiful. I know it is beautiful. I've been there and stayed with friends and family, and it is lovely. But I've never been to Vancouver in Washington, so Washington State. Barbara. Oh, now again, a question I can't answer. I will try and find out and just make a note of that. How much does it weigh? It's very heavy, but I don't know. Someone must. I'll put the weight of the tapestry, and if I can find out, I'll come back to you. Can I do that, James, by sending you a note and you'd send it off to? Good, thank you very much. And that's to Barbara. Right. So thank you for that question. Another one that I'd never thought of, but it's a good question. Diane in, is it pronounced Darian? Oh, it's skipped. Where are we? I've got to, the screen has done, oh, there we are. How many years did it take to create the tapestry? Well, as I mentioned, it's about a decade, about 10 years. It couldn't have been done in less time, really, because it's just such an incredible piece of work, and just waiting for the materials as well, because they all had to be started from scratch. You couldn't go down to the nearest store and buy what you needed. It all had to be prepared from scratch. So 10 years, I think, is the general feeling that that was the time that it took. And Gerardo in Mexico. Oh, thank you. Another just thanking me for the lecture. Thank you very much. And also Christina from San Jose in the US also saying thank you. And Heather from Minneapolis again. Thank you very much. It's nice to know that you stuck it to the end. We've answered, it's Diane from Darien. We answered that question now. And as Zana from the US said that she visited Bayeux, saw the tapestry years ago, and the cathedral is amazing. So I think, shall I whiz up to the top again, James, and see if there's, oh yes. Nancy from Leewood in the US. The colours in the tapestry seem so vibrant. Has it been restored in any way? If not, why haven't they faded? I can't imagine they would be restored. Maybe you can see, especially on the great enlargements on the Viking ships, you can see where there have been repairs and where things have been done much later. But the fact that it was only on display one day a year in the darkness of the cathedral, and then since it's in its special museum now in Bayeux, that will be under controlled lighting as well. So no doubt there is a lot of science in that as to what. So as you say, the colours are vibrant, so perhaps that's the reason. But I don't know, and I'll see if I can get back to you. Has it ever been restored? Possibly, but only not on a sort of huge scale, not like restoring a picture. So I think we are about there. That was Nancy of Leewood. Thank you, Nancy, for that. Let's see. James, any others that I haven't answered yet? That's it. Well, thank you all very much for all those questions and for triggering off other questions, which I wasn't able to answer, but we'll try. I'll send the information to James as soon as I've got it, and I'm sure he'll be able to forward it to you. Thank you. I hope to meet you one day on a cruise in the not too distant future. Meanwhile, keep well, keep safe, and keep watching Viking.TV. Good night. Oh, it's good night here. It's probably good morning where you are, or good evening, good afternoon, whatever. Take your pick. Bye.